This is a prepared statement that is being read in other locations throughout the country. The Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, because it promotes child abuse in the classroom, citizens across the United States are prepared to wage an aggressive grassroots effort to stop it. Parents and citizens across the United States are requesting an immediate injunction to stop the implementation of social, emotional, and behavioral standards and interventions that have been codified in the Every Student Succeeds Act, passed and signed into law in December of 2015. Now, although the implementation of these non-academic standards and interventions have been previously approved and funded by former President Obama through the Executive Order 12866 and the illegal ESSA flexibility waivers, Congress has not stopped the progressive execution of these experimental psychological manipulations in the classrooms of America. Because our children are at risk of abuse, we are calling for an immediate investigation. The chairman of the HELP Committee, H-E-L-P, Senator Lamar Alexander, had purposely eliminated any reference in his summary reports that would disclose the illegal and dangerous psychological techniques codified in his ESSA education legislation. So citizens now know that Senator Alexander had been informed of the abuse of mental health interventions, and he permitted to be incorporated into his legislation anyway. We are asking that we publicly recant the language in his bill that opened the door to these abuses. We request his immediate resignation if he fails to act forthrightly to remedy this critical situation. President Trump has written and released an executive order that directs Secretary of Education DeVos to enforce statutory prohibitions on federal control of education. The Every Student Succeeds Act legislation violates the protection and safety of our children. This act requires the use of abusive psychological techniques on children. These techniques are actually codified into this law. We request that Secretary DeVos immediately prohibit the use of intrusive psychological and behavioral techniques named in the legislation on America's children in American classrooms. And I'll just inject here so that everyone understands. This is cross-party lines. This is a Democrat and a Republican problem. The intervention techniques specifically named in the legislation include applied behavioral analysis, posing as positive behavior interventions and supports, multi-tiered system of supports, which is response to intervention, school-wide tiered systems of supports, specialized instructional support, early intervening services for at-risk children or those who may be at risk for mental health disabilities. Our universal design for learning. You'll have to excuse me, my voice is beginning to fail. The following list of American citizens and parent grievances explains the wrongdoing through experimental research and psychological abuse that is currently being done to children in the classrooms across America. Let's talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act. It violates the privacy of our children and families. Our children are not a commodity. Currently, businesses and corporations in higher education are able to commercialize personally identifiable information, PII, into an invisible, lucrative empire obtained by secretly data mining information through discrete memorandums of understanding. This is not only highly unethical, but a violation of student and family privacy. The Every Student Succeeds Act violates our nation's families' constitutional protections, specifically the First and Fourth Amendment and the civil rights of all students that protect them from invasive psychological experimentation techniques and manipulative mind-bending methods. ESSA violates the personal liberties of our children through the illegal data collection of their psychological data, including the use of controversial techniques that manipulate the attitudes, values, beliefs, and dispositions. This private information collected on your vulnerable child is going into every state longitudinal data system and beyond. Data on our children is entered at the local level, thus creating a psychometric dossier that is digitally transferred to the Institute for Educational Sciences, a formidable national school board. Each child's personally identifiable information, their PII, is transferred and disclosed to third parties. Parents are not properly informed because this privacy-invading process does not require parental permission. ESSA violates a student's freedom of conscience and religious freedom via the behavioral and affective molding of their minds by controversial concepts called the whole child. Parents have not been provided access to critical information about the full purposes, the exact definitions, or the algorithms. Parents are not being informed about what is really being measured through these affective standards, and what is being measured, what is being changed by these government-directed effective interventions, and what negative impact these enforced changes may have upon the personality, beliefs, and will of their children. Full disclosure has not been made to parents, nor are they aware how often these arbitrary subjective techniques are being implemented based solely on the need of their child to meet behavioral standards. These behavioral standards are subjective and vague and cannot be measured scientifically, objectively, or accurately. The algorithms are tied to government standards that are based on non-objective criteria. ESSA violates laws forbidding the federal government to nationalize education. Forced cookie-cutter methodologies and highly scripted psychological techniques are being imposed on children in the classroom, integrated and infused throughout the curriculum. Behavioral software and curricula is being formulated to meet the concrete objectives and exacting data elements of the state longitudinal data systems. Student data is being evaluated and collected through government-approved processes that both monitor and actually change the attitudes, values, beliefs, and dispositions of individual students to an established standard that is set by the government, not the parent. The child's progress toward meeting these government standards is monitored by the use of a unique national ID assigned to each child. This nationalized system violates the General Education Provisions Act, Section 524, prohibiting the federal government to supervise or direct curriculum. ESSA violates the safety of our children. It places our children in danger of being specifically psychological interventions named in the legislation. Experimental research on children is prohibited without informed written parent consent. Yet the impact of ESSA has transformed our neighborhood schools into school-based mental health centers. These medical models change the nature of education away from true academic excellence toward state-prescribed personality development. We assert this is not the purpose of education in a free society. ESSA violates constitutionally protected right of personal liberty, freedom of conscience, and the civil rights of our children by forcing them to undergo psychological, mental health interventions in the classroom under the guise of education. Now, these interventions intentionally mold a child's conscience and belief system toward government-determined, non-academic standards that cannot be objectively measured. We assert that the federal government has created and mandated specific behavioral outcomes and standards and proficiency levels for our children in violation of federal protection statutes. So we'll end that there in terms of